Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Selling to Institutional Markets, Strategies and Considerations for Montana Producers. My name is Katie Halloran and I'm the Farm to Cafeteria Coordinator at the National Center for Appropriate Technology, or more commonly known as NCAT. NCAT is a nationwide nonprofit organization with 6 regional headquarters across the country. We work on issues pertaining to sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy, and sustainable communities. Today's webinar is being funded in part by a USDA Farm to School grant and with assistance from the MSU Extension Environmental Health and Housing Department. We are very grateful for their partnership and support. Our presenter today is Ian Finch, who is the Assistant Director of Sustainability at the University of Montana. Ian will be discussing topics such as what institutions look for when sourcing local food, methods for approaching buyers, supplier best practices, food safety considerations, and other tips and tricks for partnering with institutions for wholesale success. The webinar will be followed with time for participants to ask questions of Finch as well as a panel of experts from the field. Our panel consists of the following individuals: Aubrey Roth, who is the Farm to School Coordinator with the Montana Team Nutrition Program. Jenny Montague, the Food Service Director at Kalispell Public Schools. Shay Farmer, the Food and Agriculture Coordinator at the Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center and the Lake County Community Development Corporation. And Seth Bostic, who is the Executive Chef with Thomas Cuisine Management at the Kalispell Regional Medical Center. As you're listening to today's webinar, you can type in any questions you might have in the field you see on your screen, and I will gather them up, sort them out, and have Ian and our panelists answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. We may not be able to get to all of the questions during the webinar, but we will get back to you via email in the days to come if there's any questions that we don't have time to answer. Also, before we begin, I just want to ask that you fill out a very brief survey at the end of the webinar so we can continue to provide effective outreach and education to you. And thank you so much for taking the time to do that. It's very valuable for us. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Ian Finch. Ian was born into the hills and valleys of central Montana and fell in love with the landscape and culture at an early age. He has worked in campus-based sustainable food systems since 2008, developing national campaigns with United Students for Fair Trade and the Real Food Challenge, before focusing on campus models of local food procurement and on-campus food production through the Farm to College program. Ian has a degree in environmental studies with an emphasis in sustainable food and farming from the University of Montana, is a certified permaculture designer, and enjoys nothing more than spending time on the farm. And I think it is time to get started, so I will turn things over to Ian, and thank you again for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Katie, and good morning, everyone. Katie, thank you for the nice introduction, and a big thanks to NCAT for organizing this webinar and panel discussion. And also big thanks to all of the different participants and people who joined the call. I'm really excited to share this webinar with you today, Selling to Institutions, Strategies and Considerations for Montana Producers. Again, my name is Ian and I work with the staff at Dining to procure local and sustainably grown food for our dining venues through partnerships with producers, processors, distributors, and the nonprofit and government sectors. Since its inception 12 years ago in 2003, Dining's Farm to College program has become a normalized function of the purchasing department within the large-scale food service organization. Annually, 26% of our almost $4 million food budget is redirected to local sources, with 34% of that produce coming from local farms throughout the growing season, independently and through the Western Montana Growers Cooperative. The values behind the local food purchasing program have embedded themselves within the culture of the organization, and the staff work as a team to address critical food systems barriers along the farm-to-institution supply chain. It's my pleasure to be here with you now to discuss the lessons learned from this valuable program in support of providing information to community food producers on how to access local institutional markets in your area. So we'll dive into the presentation now with the next slide. There are a lot of different things to think about when seriously considering selling into an institutional market. Sometimes it can be easy to access the programs, but more often than not, there will be processes, policies, and philosophies at institutions that are different than direct markets. And these may seem like barriers if you're trying to build a relationship with the institution as a committed buyer. But this idea of farm to institution is being unpacked, so to speak, across the country by both producers and buyers as we learn together how to build these intermediate markets that bring local food to our cafeterias and dining halls. So today with the overview, I'm going to encourage you to think about building your relationships with local institutions by discussing attributes of how to sell to them while also considering what happens on the farm. So with the next slide, we'll just take a little look at the roadmap for today's webinar. I've broken it up into two different kinds of general ideas. First, I'll go over why it's the right time, why it's exciting to be involved in the farm to institution movement. We'll consider kind of some of the challenges and benefits of the marketplace and talk about how to build relationships with food service and also just how to kind of get in the general mindset for selling wholesale to institutions. And then the second kind of set of information I'll be providing are considerations for the actual farm, what it actually might mean to farm for wholesale accounts, and how changes might actually transpire on your farm to better serve these intermediate markets. So let's delve into why it's the right time. As you can see on the screen, it's a really exciting time to be a part of the local food movement. There has never been a higher demand. According to the National Restaurant Association's annual publication of National Food Trends, the top 10 trends all have to do with local geography, sustainability, and nutrition. Large-scale programs like the National Farm to School Network, Healthcare Without Harm in the healthcare industry, and the Real Food Challenge on college and university campuses are setting national dialogues in different farm to institution markets. And according to the Community Food Security Coalition, throughout the years of 2003 to 2005, we saw a large kind of creation of farm to college programs. And then after that, in 2005, with 84 programs, we see that even in 3 years, there were over 200 by 2008. So those programs were growing really quickly across the nation. And I think that maybe an even better indicator is the farm to school movement, where again, 6 identified programs existed in 2001. And now, just over a decade later, there are over 40,000 schools participating across the nation. And I think that this is a really encouraging trend to see. So next slide, please, Katie. Farm to institution isn't just about getting locally grown food on school plates, though, as we're trying to answer kind of this larger question of how to actually adequately feed the masses through local channels that support our communities economically and equitably, while allowing food production systems to remain at scales appropriate for stewardship of the land, water, and people. But this simply can't be done through direct sales or retail markets alone. There is a need to expand our local capacity for wholesale production and consumption and find what researchers call an agriculture of the middle, where our local farms and food systems are geographically and socially organized to provide for the needs of markets that have typically been served by large-scale corporate food organizations since the Green Revolution of the mid-1900s. But opportunities abound as each of our communities have schools, universities, hospitals, corporate cafeterias, and even prisons that may present new opportunities. So with the next slide, we're going to delve into the advantages of the institutional market. Institutional food volumes are quite large, with single operations serving thousands of meals per day. What this means is that if you are able to successfully build a long-term purchasing relationship with an institution, it offers the opportunity to streamline your operations. There are different ways to look at this, but one is the possibility to sell a large volume of second-grade produce or goods to a buyer who is looking at further turning it into a product through food processing or preservation. A lot of institutions don't have, but many are looking at developing their kitchens to better be able to process fresh fruits and vegetables when they're available seasonally. And from the producer perspective, this presents an opportunity to mass market your bumper crops or other leftovers you might have at the end of the season. To do this, though, you might want to think if you are willing to drop that price at all to sell off your goods to one of the institutions. For instance, at the end of a growing season, we at UM are always looking for bulk or opportunity buys of things like tomatoes that might be less than perfect, maybe not suitable necessarily for your direct market, but are good for processing in tomato sauce that we then freeze for use over the winter. As an institution, our labor costs do go up in this process, so that's why we do it at the end of the season when we have the opportunity to buy these cheaper crops when it's at the maximum production seasonally. these larger volume sales can also translate then for the producer into streamlined storage and transportation. Fewer deliveries means fewer trips into town and less fuel costs. And then, of course, we all benefit from fewer greenhouse gas emissions. But institutional markets can also be conducive for building relationships that are reliable and last a long time, as long as you are willing to work with the market. Institutions have menus that are fairly consistent and are planned to be served for months on end. For instance, again at the University of Montana, we have a 6-week menu cycle that repeats every 6 weeks for the semester and then alternates for each semester after that. Because of this process, we can identify exactly when a menu item is being served and forecast weeks out when we think we'll need products. This type of menu planning can lend itself to seasonal menu engineering, and as a producer, I recommend you ask an institution about its menu and ask if they are open to advanced planning or forward contracting. We will talk about this more in depth later, but for now, I just want you to know that you can work with wholesale accounts to have a predictable sale rather than the unpredictability of selling to multiple farmers markets where sales may be dependent on factors you can't control, like weather or community events. And doesn't it always seem like diversity is the key to sustainability, whether ecologically on our farms or socially in our markets? If you are a direct market farmer, diversifying your market into wholesale accounts can provide you with flexibility for planning that is not possible in the direct market arena. Why put all your eggs in one market basket? And you know, consumers know to start thinking about farmers markets and their community-supported agriculture schemes when the weather is nice and when spring hits. But institutions need to buy food year-round, and many, like schools, have their highest demand during the fall, winter, and spring. Committing yourself to planning certain bulk crops to be ready during this time period can help extend your cash flow into the shoulder seasons when the direct market options taper off. For instance, in summer, farmers market sales increase. But when school starts up in the fall, buyers switch from farmers markets to retail stores for convenience. But by serving multiple markets, like selling directly to the school, you can then serve that same customer but through different outlets. This can lend itself to providing longer season work for farm staff, especially if cold storage crops are grown with a concerted effort to use practices that extend your growing season. And more generally, diversifying your markets can help balance your sales. When one market isn't performing well, another one may be booming. Finally, institutional markets can offer new methods for educating the public about our local farms and food systems. Thousands of people pass through our cafeterias, with many of them taking place in educational environments at schools and colleges. And those institutional buyers that are interested in investing in their local producers will also want to communicate the social value of their efforts. Many times they attempt to label where the food was grown and even provide information about you and your farm. This is a good way to reach customers that could be purchasing from you at farmers markets or through other schemes, and it's just a good way to diversify your market base. That's not to say that there aren't challenges though, and with the next slide we'll dive into those just a little. For those uninitiated into this process, selling to institutions may seem daunting and complicated. There may be 5 different people on the purchasing staff, and it might be hard to know who to talk to if you have questions about what they buy, how to get the check, or little things like how to update your address if you move. By nature of their bureaucracies and multiple levels of decision-making, public institutions can seem unresponsive to changes in availability and bumper crop opportunities. However, this underpins the focus on advanced planning with institutions. Often, their decision-making structure won't allow them to adequately respond to sudden availabilities of product or price changes, or even simple questions about process. Which is why it's important to ask about these things up front. Institutions often operate under policies and procedures that are outlined by local, state, and federal regulations for food procurement across different sectors. Hospitals, schools, prisons, corporate cafeterias, each will have a different process for onboarding vendors and setting you up in their system. And unlike some direct markets, you'll have to share personal information with them, like your social security number or tax ID number. But once you do start selling to them and you are set up in the system, they're going to expect a reliable supply to cover their needs. Institutions are used to procuring much of their product from one or very few vendors and don't necessarily want to work with someone who can only sometimes supply a product and sometimes not, depending on variable availability. So if you can provide for their full needs, you'll definitely have an upper hand. Now, in the farm-to-institution movement, there is a lot of talk, even earlier in this presentation, about how institutions can basically be a market for seconds. However, this really isn't the case, and I do want to dispel the rumor that food service, even in schools, is okay with working with lower quality product. Food service operations take a lot of pride in their work, especially the ones that focus on procurement from local producers. I totally understand the drive to save your top quality produce for markets that claim the highest price per unit, but in order to build long-term relationships with institutional buyers, we also need to save some of the good stuff for them. This is because food service is used to having products that come in looking the same each time, that don't blemish easily, and have long shelf life. This, of course, is limiting for the producer on what varieties you grow. However, that doesn't mean that you have to only grow conventional hybrid varieties that are selected for their shippability and shelf life, but lacking in flavor. What it does mean is that you should work with your food service partners to identify what varieties they like and then sell them those and only those. If you do want to try out a new product, take it to them and let them sample it before making a product switch. Recipes in large-scale food service are written to use certain products, and at such a large scale, these recipes can't be altered at the last minute to use different products to get the same result. Instead, the recipe will result in a less than satisfactory dish, which might make the buyer rethink working with that product instead of their kitchen processes. And of course, this also kind of then dovetails into food safety and post-harvest handling. Institutions are routinely inspected by county and state sanitarians, and food safety is part and parcel of meal service. Buyers that are responsible for the health of thousands of patrons a day take food safety seriously and will most likely want to talk to you about your practices. My guess is that as a producer, you take food safety seriously too. So plan out what you do on your farm and in your distribution channels to make sure that your food is safe and that you are able to communicate this to institutional buyers. And I understand that sometimes food safety concerns can seemingly block an institution from buying from a local farm without rigorous certifications and liability insurance concerns. And it may be true that accessing some institutions with these stringent requirements is challenging, but none are insurmountable. Chat with the buyers about what is really required to work together and identify the steps to move forward. One example I really like comes from Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, where as an institution they require all local produce providers to be certified under Good Agricultural Practices, or GAP certification. While this can be kind of hard for individual producers to get on their own, what ISU decided to do was actually provide GAP training, where they recruited and enrolled farmers in the training and then helped provide technical assistance towards GAP certification. What this meant was that the producers that did get GAP certified were automatically enrolled in their local food purchasing program and started gaining contracts to their institutional market. So they kind of took a proactive approach in helping farmers actually become food safety certified and then lock them into buying contracts with the institution. So I thought that was pretty cool. Other considerations, challenges, there is a delayed or prolonged payment when you're in the farm to institution market. Unlike direct markets that have almost instant cash value, payment from institutions needs to be processed in an accounting system before checks are issued. Institutions have large systems and may have multiple offices or departments that work together to process payments and issue checks. So you might not actually see that check in the mail for 2 or more weeks. However, this does provide you with an opportunity to plan out your cash flow and think about different ways of income through your direct and wholesale markets. You'll also have some competition with large-scale and national vendors when you start entering institutional markets. Large, highly efficient farms working with national distributors do keep prices low in the conventional market. And when you start selling to the institutions, you will be competing with these companies for sales. And likely, though not certain, their prices might be a little lower than yours. However, you do have the market edge because quality, freshness, and sustainability factors, as shown before, are the top 10 trends in the nation. These are what institutions are looking for, what they're committed to, and so definitely use those different factors to market your local, fresh, and high-quality produce. One downside that I can definitely see, even from experience in the farming industry, is decreased direct consumer contact through institutional channels. Because unless you're eating in the dining hall, you probably won't get to meet the real end customer, the literal consumer of your food, be it the student, the patient, or the inmate. However, many educational institutions host local food events that promote face-to-face contact between their customers and their farmers. So take advantage of these opportunities, not only to meet the people that eat your food, but to strengthen your relationship with the institution as a partner, rather than just a vendor, and of course, them as a partner for you, and not just as a consumer. So how do we actually do that? As we progress through the slides, we're going to see how to move from vendor-buyer relationships to actual partnerships. So let's talk a little bit with the next slide about building our relationship. Of course, you have to start by establishing contact. To do this, identify critical contacts in the organization that can help you be a long-term vendor. This includes people at multiple levels in the decision-making structure. There are receivers at the door, purchasing managers, chefs, sustainability coordinators, food course service members, maybe even get to know the director and food service manager. While it's great to know the person who physically places the order, and that's kind of the critical junction for who you need to be in contact with, it's also important to reach out to the people that are decision makers at the policy level who are making that organizational commitment to support local food producers. But in any case, the more people you have talking about you in the organization, the better. And when you do make contact, do it in the off-season or at non-peak hours. If you've ever been in a commercial kitchen at lunch hour, you will understand why. The full staff is already working at 110% to ensure that the meal service is uninterrupted and that quality is high. So I recommend calling or emailing ahead of time to make an appointment for the early afternoon, early morning or late afternoon. And then after you do make that initial contact, I totally encourage strong and regular communication. Don't let the conversation end at the invoice. Maintaining regular communication about pricing, availability, opportunity buys, and new information about your farm keeps the buyer thinking about you and your business. And you want to keep you in their mind so that when they do go to purchase from their broadline distributor, they don't just start clicking the buttons to make it easy. Another idea would be to invite buyers to your farm and to visit their venues. Once you start selling to an institution, you do get to go to the kitchen, you're dropping off the produce, you might be meeting some of the people, but it can be harder for a food service to actually get away from their job to come out and visit the farm. But I would consider hosting an actual farm tour for food service staff. I've talked with a lot of food service employees from around the nation about their local food programs, and I think that the highlight for many is gaining firsthand knowledge of the farms that they buy from through these sponsored farm tours. And like any partnership, building the farm to institution relationship requires a foundation of trust and familiarity. So how better can you do that by showing them the field where the food was actually grown? Another way to get that familiarity would be to provide case samples. Contact them to find out which products they might be interested in, and then provide them with a sample that would be kind of a replica of that from your farm, and do it in the packaging and volume that they would expect it to be delivered in under normal circumstances. I realize that that may seem like a lot, but if they aren't familiar with your product, they will be interested in the type of container, like wax box or 5-gallon bucket. They'll be interested in pack size in addition to product quality. Also, consider providing a pricing break just to get a foothold. This is only if you have to, but the food industry does it all the time. National food reps are in our offices week to week with promotions and deals, and from firsthand experience, I can really say food service staff are used to kind of getting that pricing break in order to try out a new product for the first time. And so this should be replicated in the local food arena too, just to get your foot in the door. So let's continue on with the slides and think about food, how we can think like food service. Those people are super busy in the kitchens balancing purchasing decisions with actual production, cooking, health, food safety, sustainability, and quality. And so there are so many things on their mind that when we start to think like them, we realize we really do have to streamline our own processes and be in good communication. This is because when working with multiple vendors instead of with one, it can get a little crazy. For instance, way back in 2003, when the Farm to College program first started at the University of Montana, we had only 8 vendors serving our entire campus food needs. Now, 12 years later, we're sourcing products from around 140 vendors, all of which require communication about product, pricing, research into attributes of the product that include sustainability factors, packaging, pesticide use, region where the product was grown. It's a big job to work with all these vendors, plus make sure that the food hits the table at the right time. There isn't a moment to spare. So when working with multiple vendors, buyers need their contacts to be responsive, available, organized, and professional. So take a little time to learn about the organizational philosophy, their policies and procedures. This will help you best fill the need and to really learn how the organization operates. It's important to hit the right notes when talking to them about your product and your values the first time. So if you're approaching an institution like a hospital, for instance, that might be focused on healthy, minimally processed ingredients grown without the use of potentially dangerous chemicals, then communicate how those values are embedded in your product. Are you organic? Are you sustainable? And is the product harvested only days before delivery at peak freshness and thus at peak nutrition? This is the message they're interested in. And similar messaging works with the philosophy of farm-to-school programs, where goals are to give students access to healthier fresh fruits and vegetables while educating them about nutrition and agriculture. And for colleges and universities, you can bet that at this point they've signed on to some kind of sustainability-related commitment. The big one is the American College and University President's Climate Commitment, which commits colleges and universities to a certain reduction in carbon emissions by a certain time frame, and also commits that institution to a path towards sustainability. This goes hand in hand with a food-focused college and university commitment called the Real Food Challenge, a national student-driven campaign on college campuses that works to transition 20% or $1 billion of the college and university food budget to real food by 2020. Campuses can sign the Real Food Campus Commitment, which then mandates that the university create things like food systems working groups, draft campus real food policies, and it sets the course for researching baseline purchasing data with the intent to make concerted product shifts toward foods that are community-based, ecologically sound, fair, and humane. The University of Montana is at this time the only school in the Northwest to have signed that commitment, but many are implementing the Real Food Calculator and will likely be following suit really soon on actually signing that commitment. And those different commitments that institutions can sign on to are really great indicators for which ones are going to be interested in sourcing local product. So if you can get onto those lists, find out which institutions are set up, I would recommend approaching those ones first and prioritizing them. And of course, learning about those commitments means that you can leverage them on your behalf. Let the school know things like you're only 15 miles away, and that's 100 times closer than the average distance that food travels. Then, once you match yourself with their values, have a dialogue with purchasing staff about their policies and procedures. Like I mentioned before, institutions are large and complex. Each has a different onboarding process, method, or timeline, and requirements for vendor insurance, food safety programs, and more. So to make sure that they can rest easy, provide an assurance of product quantity, quality, and safety when you meet with them. Food service professionals will want to make sure that they're going to get their product the week that they ordered it and that it'll come in the quantity and quality that they're hoping for. So make sure to be honest with yourself, though, too, and with your buyers about what you can reasonably produce. They may ask you to cover all of their volume needs. But if this isn't possible, like with a really large institution like a college, then talk to them about sourcing your local product in a different way, maybe once a week or for a special event or special menu throughout the year. Also, consider having a quality guarantee or return policy. Food service buyers are used to having this option with national distributors and will be encouraged by you, or to buy from you too, if your guarantee also ensures that the product will be satisfactory or that they won't have to pay for it. So again, educate yourself on procurement regulations, especially for those institutions that are in the public sector. Look up procurement law in your state as it relates to these institutions. For instance, meat must be processed in inspected facilities, USDA or state inspected, and value-added and processed products must be made in certified or inspected kitchens with requirements for labeling and traceability. If you aren't up to these standards from the beginning, it will be hard to access the institutional market. So how do we understand the buyer a little bit more? With this next slide, we'll see that really what these buyers are looking for is product availability for as long as possible. Obviously, you can give yourself an edge in the market by proving yourself to be stable and reliable. Institutions really like consistency. I can't harp on consistency enough. If they order from you and they get the same product each time, they're going to be loyal. So find out exactly what product specifications they need. Product specifications include product type, size, flavor profile, ripeness, number in a pack, box, or case, and of course the price. Find out what the buyer is used to and see if you can provide something similar. If your product is totally different, that's fine, that's great. But definitely provide a case sample so they can become more familiar with your product specifications before agreeing to make a purchase. Then maybe find out even how they're using your product. You're the expert in the field when it comes to varieties of produce or ingredients. Maybe you have the world's best paste tomato and it isn't even on their radar, and for some reason they're buying your beefsteak tomato to make sauce. If you find this out, politely suggest the alternative variety, and then again, provide a sample. And then what about volume and packaging? Again, be consistent. Once you find out about the specs for the actual packaging to get into the kitchen, make sure that you don't vary your pack size or box type without approaching the buyer first. Buyers don't like surprises, so if you do change it, communicate this in advance to avoid surprises. Something else to consider would be best time for deliveries. Whatever you do, don't deliver to the kitchen's peak hours. These are typically 11 to 1 and 5 to 7. The kitchen will be in full production mode, so crazy busy, and may not even be able to receive a delivery. You definitely don't want to drive all the way into town just to go back with your box of produce and invoice empty-handed with money. So that in mind, though, how much time does the kitchen need for lead time for product availability? Well, it'll completely depend on them, but you'll want to find out when they're placing their normal orders. For instance, if they place an order with their broadline distributor like Cisco on a Monday, make sure that you get them your availability list and prices on Thursday or Friday the week before so that they can plan out what to order on Monday. Order deadlines for large-scale institutions are mandatory, so if you haven't gotten your information to the buyer before it's time to place that big order, they will most likely lump in what they could have purchased from you into their broadline purchase just to cover their bases. So again, with that price list, make sure to include it with your availability and communicate any changes in price up front. Food service software tracks final costs on invoices throughout the year, so variation in price will be noticed. So that being said, try to remain price consistent. And if you do have increases or decreases in your cost because of external factors like gas costs going up or labor costs, especially if it's a long-term problem, then write it down and actually send it as a letter to the institution to communicate how these long-term problems are affecting your price. And then again, reliable supply and consistency in pack size is of utmost importance for the buyer. Choose one that works for the institution and then remain consistent. Ease of billing and payment through invoicing is always important as well. The paper trail is how you ensure your payment. So if an invoice gets lost at the kitchen, you should make sure to have a record of it at the farm so that you can print it out and follow up with the buyer. Not to say that our institutions are losing invoices very often, but if that does happen, if that's the case, you will want to have a backup. And of course, invoicing in general is the payment process that institutions use with our large accounting systems. Cash on demand or on delivery is very hard to find at this point. So definitely plan to have that invoice ready. And this is all, of course, dovetailing into logistics of the institutional market. Overall, here's a graphic depicting the farm to institution cycle with a focus on planning and evaluation. As you plan out how you might start to diversify into the institutional marketplace, I would identify the processes for each one of these steps and then make sure to keep a schedule. It does require advanced planning to be a solid institutional producer. So you may want to consider starting off with selling to one or few smaller institutions and then evaluating how that relationship is working before approaching large-scale facilities. You'll want to make sure that you think about your timing for not only approaching them to start off your relationship, but also timing for how to deliver, when they need to do business reviews, when they need to order. And then think about how you're distributing to them, whether it's through your own truck or through a distributor. Find out where they actually receive the product. There might be multiple doors on the back side of the kitchen. You don't want to be going to the wrong one and knocking and they're expecting you and you can't show up. Think about their billing processes and then meet with them maybe in the winter to actually do an evaluation of the business relationship and ask questions about how is the product working for you? How is delivery schedule working? Can we do more planning during the winter so that I can actually lay out my farm to meet your needs? Those are the questions you can ask over the winter to then go through this planning process to be truly successful in the farm to institution cycle. And of course, all of this will be backed up by record keeping. This is important to track both production and business practices, things like that at least food service will be interested in are where your water is coming from. Is it potable? Are you using drinking water for irrigation or is it coming out of the creek? What's your fertility source? Are you using manure, compost, or fertilizer? How long is it being applied before you're harvesting? Are you considering things like employee food handling and worker health and hygiene? And are you documenting these things so that when the institution is curious, you can back them up? What about packaging, storage, and transportation practices? Are you taking temperatures on your produce? Is it 40 degrees, 60 degrees? Cleaning and sanitation schedules, of course, are important, especially if you have larger packing facilities. This would be seen more on truly wholesale-oriented farms that are maybe using more mechanization or machinery to do their cleaning, packaging, and storage. This would all be with time and temperature records, and also financials and insurance. I just touched on it, but with your financials, you definitely want to keep track of your invoices and receipts for institutions. I know that here at the University of Montana, we keep all of our invoices for 5 years. That way, if we get audited or if we need to go back to double check if a product was paid, we have that. But it's also a good idea to keep those records on your farm for a certain amount of time. And then, of course, insurance too. Liability insurance will probably be asked for by an institution. So if you have it, make sure that you can document it and have it prepared for them before going in for your initial meeting. Okay, and once you have all of those and you start actually placing orders and getting purchases, we like to share a sample invoice with our buyers just because it's really varied across the spectrum on how people actually go about doing their invoicing. I recommend going out and finding a template online or in Microsoft Word and then sticking to it. There are, of course, various aspects to an invoice that help us track what we're buying. You'll see on the slide a sample invoice that we use in the Farm to College program. The writing is pretty small on there, but the critical pieces are the item description, the unit size, the price per unit, the total number of units, and then that total cost. And again, this is the information that we end up then putting into our accounting system so that we can track our processes and our purchases throughout the full year. And so when you have a product name for an item, really try to stay consistent with that. Otherwise, it'll end up looking like we're buying 10 different products from one farm, even though it may just be one product. Like a cherry tomato, for instance, sometimes it comes in as tomatoes pint size 12-pack. Sometimes it might come in as cherry tomato mixed pack or something like that. And we have staff that then just input that directly into the system. So if we can stay consistent with our language, it helps us stay consistent with our accounting systems so that we can actually know what we're buying from you and follow up and be a committed and solid buyer. And this will all then translate into pricing, negotiation, and agreement on the next slide. Once your relationship is in place and you have built that relationship with the buyer, you can consider developing a written agreement. It can be valuable to have the written expectations on paper to prevent future misunderstandings and have basic language from which you can evaluate your business relationship. And then, of course, once you've written one for one institution, you can use it as a model for agreements with other buyers, and it won't take as long to prepare. So this is really talking about what the pricing structure will look like in the long term. Most agreements are coming to like terms on pricing. So the big question is, what kind of volume do you need as a producer to have the institution commit to in order to lock in an agreed upon price for the certain amount of time? Many agreements are for 1 year and are renegotiated every year, probably over the winter or whenever you guys mutually decide to do a business review. The goal of the agreement or contract in the farm to institution market should be attempting to find a win-win situation for everyone in the supply chain. If you're going through a negotiation process, don't you want it to work for everyone? I know I do. So be sure to make an extra effort here if the institution you are agreeing to formally work with will represent a large portion of your sales. We have modeled that institutional commitment can make a business model work by providing stability with a large market over the long term, especially while a producer is developing the rest of their market connections. However, producers should be careful in this case to have written agreements. What would you do if an institution had staff changeover or if they suddenly decided to streamline their buying processes and just go with their broad line? You certainly want to have backups, and without a written agreement, there is very little to protect you. And of course, the depth of your agreement is up to you and your institution, and the various types of agreements are defined rather broadly. Technically, even verbal agreements are held as contracts in the eyes of the law, so I'm going to distinguish these agreements further into memoranda of understanding, or MOUs, and memoranda of agreement, or MOAs. The MOU is typically more relationship-focused, possibly vague, but pretty flexible. It might contain language about seeking to partner together to pre-plan for the 2016 growing season and commit to talking maybe once a week to update on price and availability. But no technical financial details are committed to or any specific purchasing amount agreed upon. These would be saved for the memorandum of agreement, where the producer is agreeing to provide a certain amount of product at a certain price, and the buyer is agreeing to ensure purchase of that product at the agreed upon price. This should set out an actual operational plan for both parties to follow. I think a good example of this has been our work in the past with Yellowstone grass-fed beef, the University of Montana's primary beef vendor. We were both new to striking agreements for farm-to-institution purchases the first time we decided to put our relationship in writing. The process took almost 4 months and had a lot of back and forth regarding environmental and social factors that affect pricing, a detailed analysis of our menus and volumes required for different cuts of beef, and caveats about certain products that Yellowstone had that they wanted to sell us in exchange for a price break on what we really wanted, which was the ground beef. That way, they could practice good inventory management and control their sales in exchange for a price break on the main product that Dining wanted. So it really worked out for both of us. And of course, entering into this institutional commitment gave them a solid foundation to work on, whereas in the beginning, made up almost 80% of their business volume. By the time that we had worked through several years of it, Yellowstone had increased their sales sufficiently that although buying the same amount of product per year, decreased to around 30% of their annual business volume. Without a written commitment, this probably would have been really risky for them. However, as you can see, it really paid off. With the cash flow from as the larger customer, Yellowstone was able to work out their operational plan to satisfy our needs while also reaching out to customers to diversify their market base and grow their business. With that exponential growth over the last 5 years and a testimonial from them, it really was largely due to a commitment from a large-scale food service institution symbolized in that written agreement that enabled them to then go out and grow their business. So overall, components in these agreements should include names of parties and business names, a date range for the agreement, products and amounts of those products that will be produced and purchased, size, packaging, and distribution information, a commitment to a certain type of production, for instance, if you're organic, expected delivery and payment schedules, other product standards. You could consider a clause on how to change or update your agreement, a plan to address issues with any part of the process, and clauses that make it a little bit more flexible for the party in case you do disagree or have changes throughout the year. For instance, it might be a good idea to put in a clause about not being held to providing product in the event of a natural disaster or other disruption that's totally out of your control. Also, make sure to include the signatures of decision makers. Other issues you may want to include are insurance information, post-harvest and food safety requirements, product exclusivity agreements, and quality assurance. But in any event, if you don't have a written agreement, it's still good to follow up with a written understanding of what you've agreed upon with an institution and barriers that you might have faced in reaching true agreement. That being said, those are a lot of market considerations, but these are really going to translate into different considerations on the farm. So what might it look like to farm for wholesale markets? Wholesale and direct marketing can be mutually beneficial as they help diversify your cash flow opportunities. However, farming systems for wholesale-oriented farms can end up looking a little bit different. Unfortunately, gross income per acre is lower in wholesale, so growers often make up for that price decrease in volume. You would have to have additional land to do this, or consider streamlining what crops you actually grow. You might have a possible need for efficiency through mechanization, and scaling up might require more labor also. So as we get a little bit bigger, the big question then, of course, is how do we actually scale up to meet those wholesale demands while still maintaining the integrity of our farms? I know that a lot of local farmers around here that sell to institutions have really high sustainability standards and ethics for their farms. And we shouldn't be sacrificing those ethics just to sell to our wholesale markets and institutions. One example, though, of how to do that without losing integrity on the farm would be through social kind of changes, like selling through a growers cooperative, where maybe there's like the Western Montana Growers Cooperative, where we can still have our small farms with their sustainable production practices, but then have that kind of middleman aggregating and distributing the produce to help access these larger markets. So I think that that's a really good case study and model for how to go about doing it without actually changing your farm to maybe only grow 10 crops or something like that with an acre per each crop. That being said, with the next slide, we do have to look at our crop planning. Over the winter, when you're talking to institutional buyers, they're actually going to be interested in maybe having you plant specific crops for their wholesale accounts. So things to consider when doing that would be to plant in succession for that consistent supply I was talking about earlier. Maybe devote a block of your field to a lettuce crop for an institution, and then plant a certain amount each week that you think will be made up for that market demand, and then week by week you can grow that amount for the wholesale market. Of course, investing in season extension infrastructure will be really important for accessing wholesale markets. Again, they're really cranking in the fall and in the spring, and so any edge that you can give yourself on that growing season is really going to help you get access to the institutional market during the non-summer season. One other thing to consider, and I just had to throw this in there for the food safety aspect, would be to minimize opportunities for soil contact when you're doing your crop planting. Maybe consider using drip irrigation or put a cover crop under taller crops. Any visible soil that is on produce when it's being received is terms basically to turn that produce away from the back door. So just make sure that it's, take every precaution to make sure your produce is as clean as possible. And other ways to do that would be to consider different things from the field to the packing shed on the next slide. When we are harvesting, talk to your buyers to see what stage of ripeness is actually preferred for your produce. If you see on the screen there the little variation in tomato color, a lot of institutional buyers, for instance, are actually going to want their tomatoes delivered to them a little bit underripe, kind of at that stage 4 tomato there, where it's considered a turner, so that they have more control to actually store it in their dry storage area and then use them when they're at the peak ripeness, rather than getting it delivered when it's perfectly ripe. That would be perfect for a direct market. But talk to your buyers and see what stage of ripeness they actually prefer, and then harvest that produce when it's cool in the morning for maximum freshness and shelf life. And my idea kind of here is that I want to address this need of institutions to buy those conventional boring varieties of produce just because they have shippability and shelf life. I totally think that we can still purchase delicious locally grown heirloom varieties of produce, but on the producer end, we need to be really focused on ensuring that our cultural practices and our harvest practices will extend that shelf life on that produce for as long as possible. So again, that's getting it out of the field really early in the morning, getting the field heat off of it, and then maintaining the cold chain, and then getting it to the institution as quickly as possible. Another factor that you might think about is sorting damaged produce in the field, and consider field packing crops that are suitable for field packing. That's just so that you're not commingling produce that might have blemishes or mold growing on them with the good produce that's going to be later sorted. You want to get that out of there as soon as possible. So more aspects of that from the field to the packing shed on the next slide. Again, when thinking about food service, we're really trying to maintain the cold chain all the way through. We're really focused on that in our own kitchen, and so if that can be replicated on the farm as much as possible, we really appreciate it. I've seen studies on broccoli, for instance, where if you stick a thermometer in the head of broccoli at 8 o'clock in the morning, air temperature in there might be 40 degrees, which is perfect. You want to get that harvested and cooled down as quickly as possible. Stick the thermometer in at 3 p.m. You're still harvesting. The internal temperature of that broccoli might be 75, 80 degrees. You're going to harvest it, and with respiration rates, that's going to start to degrade rather quickly. So again, think about those wholesale accounts, because they're probably going to be holding on to their produce for a little bit longer than your direct markets. You might want to consider harvesting that produce first while it's cool and getting it chilled. Other things to consider from the field to the packing shed would be to minimize hauling of harvested produce. Once you start farming for wholesale, you might have a couple more acres on your farm, and you might have different infrastructure concerns where you're actually hauling produce from one site to another on the farm, and then into a storage facility, and then maybe even to an aggregator facility like the co-op, and then that's going to be transported to an institution. And so the less you can move it around, you're reducing the risks for those nicks, bumps, and scrapes that are going to then lead to product degradation in the long term. And also to make sure that it's clean, all tools and containers cleaned before harvest. All right, so let's move on to just a couple of considerations for storage and packing. If you don't have access to cooling or refrigerated facilities, I would consider maybe only growing low respiration crops for the institutional market. Things that are going to be okay at room temperature for a while, where you're actually holding them before shipping them to the institution. You might want to also think about whether to store produce clean or not clean. I think this happens a lot with root crops, where it's totally great to store them with the dirt still on them. And there are studies that indicate that that improves shelf life. But I've also seen pictures and produce firsthand where it's been stored dirty, and then while you can get all of that dirt off later in the season, it can leave stains or other blemishes on the produce that might just be not as eye-friendly. And so, consider talking to your institution to see how they feel about that, and then consider cleaning all of that produce before storage if you can still handle that with your production schedules. And then, of course, just like kitchens, practice first in, first out rotations. Label your boxes with your farm name and address. It's really important to have traceability in case of a foodborne illness outbreak. And then always include a packing slip or invoice with the delivery. It's really important to have it at the time. Our receivers are supposed to be trained to deny a delivery if there is no invoice with it to check off of. And so just be aware that having that might give you guaranteed entrance into a kitchen. So that's kind of your entry point. And then also just as a consideration with producers listening, ask your buyers at wholesale markets to save your wax boxes, totes, or other containers if you want to reuse them. They should be willing to do it. Our kitchens are pretty large. We'll find a space, and then that can save you some money on that end. So then kind of just one of my last things for actual on-farm thoughts. Here's a little diagram of classification of crops by respiration rates. I would say that if you are considering selling to wholesale markets and institutions and you don't have good refrigerated facilities, consider growing the low respiration crops. So if you look at that, you can see apples, beets, celery, garlic, melons, onions, potatoes. These are lower respiration crops. We can then hold them. Institutions can do bulk purchases of them and hold them themselves. The very high crops like broccoli, mushrooms, peas, sweet corn, parsley, spinach, these are going to degrade rather quickly, and unless you can deliver to an institution, the day after harvest, in kind of concert with when they're actually going to be serving it, it might be a little bit harder for them to hold on to those products for the long term. So just, again, it's all about building a relationship and chatting with your institutional buyers. So go over this list with them and see what they are interested in. So moving on, just some final thoughts for accessing institutional markets. Adding value through processing is a big one. Our partner for this is Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center, but I know that there are a lot of other kind of small-scale food processing facilities out there, or even commercial kitchens that producers can rent in order to value add their product. As I said before, a lot of institutional kitchens aren't equipped with processing equipment to adequately use fresh fruits and vegetables and other whole ingredients. And so by working with an actual processor, you might be able to get those into packaging, get it frozen to the specs that institutions are looking for. And then kind of on top of that, they can help you share your story. And as my final slide, I just kind of want to say that anything that you can do to really create a story that shares your philosophy and ethics behind your farm and behind your produce can get you price premiums from these institutions that are looking to communicate these values to their consumers as well. So consider providing a written description of your farm and your farming style, your philosophy, have pictures of your farm and you and your family for the buyer. And then if you're blazing a trail for selling to local institutions in your area, get it publicized. This stuff is really popular now, and if you get your relationship with an institution made public, that's really going to help solidify that relationship for the long term. So again, it is really about marketing yourself, accessing these institutions, and then creating long-term relationships with them through discussion and dialogue throughout the year, and also with that evaluation step. So with that, all of that in mind, here are some resources to go out and look at. The National Center for Appropriate Technologies Farm to Cafeteria program has great resources from last year too. Some local people did full presentations just focused on food safety, on-farm food safety, so those were really great. Cornell Cooperative Extension out in New York has great resources for farmers on GAP certification in food safety and also accessing institutional markets. And then I highly recommend familyfarmed.org's Wholesale Success, a Farmer's Guide to Food Safety, Selling, Post-Harvest Handling, and Packing Produce. It's a great manual with tips and tricks for selling wholesale, but then also per crop information on how to do post-harvest handling for those, and it's a great resource. Much as will be our panel of presenters after this talk. So thank you, everyone. That is the end of my presentation, and I think we're going to open it up for questions to the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian, for all that very valuable information. And we are going to open up this webinar for questions. So I've been compiling the ones that have come in from folks who are watching. Thank you for submitting those. And as I said before, if we don't have time to answer all of the questions before we adjourn at 12:15, then we will certainly follow up with email answers in the next couple of days. So, and just to remind you who our panelists are, we have Seth Bostick is our executive chef. He is from the hospital. perspective, we have Shay Farmer from the Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center, Jenny Montague is the food service director at Kalispell Public Schools, and Aubrey Roth is the farm to school coordinator from the Montana Team Nutrition Program, and then of course Ian, who we just heard from. So we'll just jump into the questions. So the first one I have is, does a farm have to be GAP certified to sell to institutions? And Ian, I'll maybe have you answer that first, and then we'll hear from the school and hospital for their perspective.
Sure, thank you, Katie. That is a great question, and it's really up to the institution and for kind of the level of stringency that they're going to put on food safety certifications for farmers. No, you do not have to be GAP certified to sell to institutions. Again, that is up to them. So, in our state, Montana State University does have that requirement. University of Montana doesn't. I'm not as familiar with the hospital arena or with the K-12 schools. I think Aubrey can address that. But yeah, the short answer is no, you do not have to be GAP certified.
Great, thank you. And then Aubrey, if you want to answer that and kind of along those lines, a question of, do I need any licenses or certifications to sell to schools? So Aubrey, if you want to answer, and then Jenny will have you answer after from your experience.
Awesome. No, farmers do not need to have GAP certification to sell to schools, just like any other institution, unless the school does set that. There are a couple schools in our state that do use food service management companies, and they typically do have either an insurance requirement or a GAP certification requirement, depending on the business. So check with the school that you want to work with. Along the lines of other certifications or licenses that you have to have, there's no farmer license. So if you're selling unprocessed fruits or vegetables, then there's no licensing required. However, if you're selling meat, you have to have that processed in a state or a federally inspected facility. Eggs, you need to have the egg handler license, which is the candling process, and they need to be grade B or higher to go into schools and other institutions. Yeah, so I think that about covers it. But for farmers, just unprocessed, no, there's no licensing. If you get into processed foods, then there's the food licensing under the Health and Human Services.
Great, thank you. Jenny, do you have anything to add from the school perspective?
We do not require GAP certification here, but we do prefer it. And if a farm doesn't have GAP certification, we have an on-farm food safety checklist that we go through with a farmer, and we keep on file and update annually to make sure that we feel comfortable with their practices.
Great, thank you. And then Seth, what about from your experience from the hospital?
As a hospital's perspective, we serve a clientele that is otherwise compromised, so we require GAP insurance and a fairly high level of it as well. If you're a meat producer or a cattle producer, we require that you have to be done through a USDA inspected facility and have up to $5 million worth of GAP insurance. If you are a produce producer, we lower it down a little bit, and that goes upon the farm safety inspections as well. And that can go anywhere from $2 to $5 million.
Great, thank you. And then Shay, if you have anything to add as well from your experience of what you look for GAP certification if farmers are looking to use your facilities or work with you, do you have anything to add on that?
At the moment, it's not required, but we prefer it because that is the way the industry is moving towards. Everything that we process, we have to be able to trace back to the original farm. Yeah, that's what
Great. Thank you. Okay, next question that we received, and Ian, I'll let you take this one, is can you describe better the term agriculture of the middle? Does this attempt to address the limitations of direct marketing?
Sure. So agriculture of the middle would be looking at kind of this middle ground where, if you go out and look at agricultural statistics, say in the most recent 2012 census that was just put out this year by the USDA, you'll see a concentration of farms kind of in the below 50-acre realm, and then in above 1,000 acres. And even in Montana, with specialty crop growers, people that are doing small-scale produce, 50 acres would be a lot. But that being said, it's kind of a category, and most of our farms are on the smaller end of that, 10 acres and below for small vegetable farms. And what the ag of the middle kind of movement is trying to say is that farms, in order to correctly, as the question indicated, in order to address some of the direct market issues and really open up different markets and have access for more people in our big institutions, we do need to think about how to farm in a way that can produce more of one crop for this larger market. So, instead of having your CSA harvest each week for 50 people, can you actually produce 10 acres of carrots that are going to be coined and frozen to meet these kind of food service needs? And farms will have to end up looking a little bit bigger than that. You might have to have a full acre of carrots or 2 full acres of carrots. Maybe you can break up that acre into smaller parcels, again, to have better crop rotations. But the ag of the middle is saying we need to scale up our food system a little bit to better access these larger markets. And then as a kind of an alternative to that, though, you can think of an ag of the middle physically on our farms, but also socially in the way we arrange ourselves. So growers, cooperatives, and other groups where we're cooperatively aggregating our produce would also be considered kind of an ag of the middle, but more of that cultural and social end. Hopefully I addressed that question well enough.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and if anyone, again, as you think of questions or have follow-up questions, please continue to submit those and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Okay, I have a question here. My price is higher than what the school currently pays for the same product. Can they still buy from me? And Aubrey, I'll have you address that first, and then we can hear from the other institutions as well, but we'll start with the school market. Yeah, Aubrey, go ahead.
All right, thanks for the question. Yes, schools can pay a little bit higher. They do have to follow procurement processes, and so they do need to have something in place that says, we will purchase local products X amount over a normal price. They can also, if they're purchasing under the small purchase threshold, they can just get quotes from, say, like 3 local providers and decide that they are going to go with that if that fits within their budget. And that's the really key point that I think Jenny will be better at addressing.
Great, thank you. Jenny?
Yeah, absolutely. We do oftentimes choose products locally because they're a better option and they're better for our local economy that cost more than they would from our mainline distributor. We do follow the USDA's procedures for competitive bidding, but it's within, within the local market, so you'll be competing with other local producers.
Great, thank you. And Seth, what about for you at Kalispell Regional Medical Center? Are you able to pay higher than maybe where you could get it elsewhere for a local product?
Sure, there's a reasonable smoke and mirror show that goes along with this. So we already know that there's going to be an elevated cost with a local sustainable product. So in doing so, we understand that the support structure has to be balanced with some commodity buying. So there's certain times of year that I know that I'm going to pay an elevated cost for, say, lettuce and tomatoes in the summertime. So in the wintertime, I just have to make sure that I balance that within a budget and then know when I need to stop buying the expensive one and buying the cheaper version so that I can make my numbers match. Regardless of that, though, the product quality speaks volumes. So if the product is brought to the door in a case size that is clean and manageable, and the price point is somewhere in between what would be charged to the general public at a farmer's market and then would be also to a commercial vendor such as myself, has been discussed and is lower than what is out there, and then that is more or less the selling properties that I need to hear to make certain that we can have a good business deal.
Great, thank you. And Ian, what about you? What's your response to that?
As far as the price premium goes, I just wanted to say a couple of things really quickly. One is that we track all of our food costs in relation to our full budget. And we have found that in the last 13 years of the Farm to College program, even though we're now purchasing over $866,000 worth of local products per year, our food cost hasn't gone up at all. In fact, it's gone down. And that has, as Seth was saying, that's been to, we can attest that that's from rigorous negotiation with Cisco and our other companies to lower prices there as well. But that's a huge success that we have found for ourselves. And also, I was recently reading a report from Healthcare Without Harm, looking at the hospital food sector in California, kind of where they have a stronghold. And what they found was that hospitals were able to purchase up to 38% of their produce locally without having budget factors included. And so, maybe it's through those opportunity buys again, or when there's a bumper crop and then getting it processed or something like that. But that's what Healthcare Without Harm found. And so, if people are interested, I would point them in the direction of that study, because they actually did find that 38% of our budget can be redirected to local produce without increasing our food cost.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Agreements are great for one producer or group of producers, but how then does a new producer or producer group gain access to an institutional market? And the follow-up to that is, have you seen competition for institutional market access increasing, and how will institutions respond? Ian, would you like to answer this first, and then we'll open it up to anyone else who'd like to chime in? And I can read that again too if need be.
Sure. So what I'm hearing is mostly about what does competition look like in the institutional market, and how are institutions responding to that. I would say that it varies across the spectrum. Again, it really depends on kind of the maturity and ability of that institution's purchaser or purchasing department. It is really nice to get that contract set up with a local grower, just because the whole movement is, at least right now, we're trying to frame it within the context of values and commitment to local growers. And so once that contract is in place, it might be hard for another buyer to come, or excuse me, another producer to come in and start selling to that institution, because it might be locked up. That's not to say that it wouldn't change from year to year. I do know some institutions have things like weekly produce bids that does increase and encourage competition, where basically they have, the spreadsheet list of produce that they're looking for, and produce is almost always exempted from the mainline distributor contracts. And so they bid it out by the week, and then different producers and companies respond, put in their price for each of those products, and then the institution will decide who they're going to buy from that week based off of those prices. Again, that's going to be very hard for local producers to compete in, just because regional and national vendors are keeping their eyes out for that. But at the same time, if you do have products that you're selling through a regional distributor like Charlie's Produce or Spokane Produce or Butte Produce or the Growers Co-op, that might be more price competitive, and I would definitely encourage those people to direct their distributor to also look at those competitive pricing bids. But yeah, competition is getting more steep as producers are looking to sell to institutions. And it's especially true at the end of the season, when a bunch of producers have, all of the produce coming out of their field because the frost is coming. That's kind of the biggest time where we get a lot of calls all at once with good deals, and people are lowering their prices and their opportunity buys. And so it gets more competitive for sure.
Great, thank you. Jenny, have you seen competition increase for you at the school market? And if so, how do you respond and work with new producers, also having agreements with the ones that are already existing?
Absolutely, yeah. This has just become a factor in the last year or two, and it's very important as a public institution for us to be fair and to, contact those and respond to those who contact us in regards to our local purchasing plan. And it's a good thing for us. It helps us meet our bottom line, and we're exposed to a higher variety of produce and different options. So, it is a little tough sometimes to tell a producer who we've been working with that we may purchase less from them in the year just to distribute, our share of the market. But I think that it's important and it's part of the industry and it's good for farming in general in Montana. And like Ian mentioned with the meat producer that he works with, Yellowstone, they've found other markets. So University of Montana helped get them started, and now they've expanded and diversified. And we've noticed that that's happened with some of our producers as well. And to tack on to the earlier conversation, we also have found that our prices in general our food costs haven't gone up since we've begun buying locally. In the last 3 years, we buy about 30% locally, redirecting over $200,000 a year. And by switching from the model that schools used to use, and our school district used to use a pre-processed item, food costs have actually gone down by switching to more scratch food. So that's compensated for the higher local prices.
Great, thank you. And Seth, do you have anything to add in terms of seeing an increase in competition and how you deal with that?
Yeah, there's been a fair amount of people that have come out and kind of started to figure out how that works and how they can get it to us when the fashion where it's cleaned. And there's been a couple of different food hubs. Western Montana Growers Co-op has really kind of stepped up and got their prices to a good place to where we can work with them, and they've been able to get a lot more farmers underneath their belts as well, which gets them to my door, and with competitive prices as well. As goes for personal people coming through, working with you guys has opened up quite a bit of that as well. So we've gotten a few phone calls and different resources for being able to get the produce and for the meats through our door. Competitively, the market out there is enough product during the summertime to saturate the market, and we don't really have a hard time being able to share the wealth. Purchasing power, we have a considerable amount of it, so it's pretty rare that we're going to be able to have enough people or enough producers bring us food that we have too much of it. So the hardest part of the competition is that there's just it's welcomed, and there can be more if there's enough people out there that would like to do it. Because right now, I don't have enough, is what I'm trying to say.
Great, thank you. And we have a couple more minutes. We received a question referencing, Ian, you talked about educating the public earlier, and the question was, can classes be focused around the kitchen? In other words, can this be added to the curriculum? And Aubrey, would you like to answer this in terms of K through 12? And then Ian, if you have something on the college level to add, and Jenny, similarly, please chime in. But Aubrey, if you can start with that. Can classes be focused around the kitchen? In other words, can this be added to the curriculum?
Absolutely, and I would highly recommend that specifically producers look for opportunities to connect with classrooms, or at least educational opportunities with the kids. If the kids learn about or help grow or come to the farm and see the broccoli growing, they will be more likely to eat it, and there's less waste in the food service, and that will make the food service definitely happy. So some opportunities, we're working with NCAT and other statewide partners to develop a Montana Harvest of the Month program that will combine education with more of these local foods in the cafeterias in both, hopefully, schools, which we're working on now, and then in the future, other institutions. And then I think a really good resource to start with if you're interested in the educational opportunities is talking with the school principal. And then connecting, if there's a Food Corps member nearby, go to the montanafoodcorps.org site and see if there's someone in your area that you could connect with and do some fun educational activities, because the kids love it and they think farmers are rock stars, which of course they are, but they get really excited. So.
Great, thank you. Jenny, do you have anything to add to that about educating the public that you've seen in the K through 12 setting?
Well, definitely Food Corps has been a really successful way for us to do that, and we always like to do a taste test with a new menu item or a new vegetable that we're using, and to have a farmer in the cafeteria I think would be fantastic. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's a big hit.
Great, thank you. And Ian, do you have anything to add? We have about one more minute and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are a lot of like summer camps for kids that are centered around gardening and cooking and that connection. We have one here at the university. I know there's one with Madison Farm to Fork down in Ennis. And then also one thing I was really excited to see was an actual certificate program in sustainable culinary arts from Colorado Mountain College in Colorado, where they're specifically teaching the connection between farms, procurement, and the culinary arts. And I think it's really cool.
Great, thank you. And we are going to sneak in one last question. If you have this off the top of your head, panelists, what percentage of all of your purchases are from within Montana? So I'll just go through, and if you know, you can shout that out. Seth, do you know that percentage off the top of your head?
I average 32%.
32%, okay. Jenny, do you know?
We were about 29% last year.
Great. And Ian?
26.
Great. And then Shay, the products that you guys process?
All of the fresh produce that is sent to institutions is all local, and then we have 2 of our own local items, and they use all local items except for spices, typically.
Great. And then Aubrey, do you have a sense statewide for the schools?
Well, I think the USDA census reported 10% purchasing for the 2011-2012 school year.
Great. Thank you. So that is all the time that we have, and I know we did not get to all of the questions that came in, so as I said, we'll get back to you via email if your question was not answered. So thank you for submitting those, and thank you again for joining us. The webinar will be posted in the next few days on the ATRA website. That's www.atra.ncat.org, and that's on your screen right now underneath my contact information. And you will also receive an email notification when that is available. So, and I just want to remind you again, if you can take a minute to complete the survey, you'll see on your screen after we close. We would so appreciate that. Your feedback is very, very valuable. So thanks to all of our panelists and Ian, our presenter, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We appreciate it and hope to be in touch soon. Thank you.